This is the brand new Castle Cobra 5 8S ESC, and if this thing turns out to be any good, this could be the best premium large-scale ESC you can get. And to find out if that's the case, we're going to be testing this thing in the heavily upgraded Ultimate Traxxas XRT, and if it survives this, we're going to be using it to convert this massive 35-pound gas-powered 1/5 scale buggy, which should be interesting because no one currently makes a conversion for this, so we're going to have to do it ourselves. The Cobra 5 is very similar in exterior design to the current XLX2. However, it has Castle's new 32-bit system in it, comes with a bunch of new features, and should be more reliable than the XLX2. This thing's gonna come in two different flavors, the Cobra 5 and the Cobra 5 Ace. The Cobra 5 is gonna be for bashers and will have some safety features to prevent this thing from melting itself into the ground. And then the Cobra 5 Ace will be completely unlocked, allowing speedrunners to get the most power and speed out of this thing that they can. This ESC is gonna be 3 to 8S compatible. The Cobra 5 is gonna come with 8 AWG input wire. The Ace will have 6 AWG input wire. This has 8mm bullets for the motor. Comes with a 4-hole mounting system on the bottom, which I believe is going to be M3. This ESC has a full aluminum top housing with a plastic cap. Of course, this is set up for sensored operation and includes a standard sensor cable. It also includes the standard Castle switch, which personally I'd love to see updated. This isn't a terrible switch, but it does tend to go bad if it gets wet too many times. Fortunately, you can just tie these two wires together, which will turn the ESC on anytime it's plugged in. Speaking of plugs, Castle is carrying on their semi-proprietary fan plug, but fortunately all of those connectors are able to be replaced, which is a really nice feature on these ESCs. If you damage any of these wires, it's about 15 bucks for a new harness and you're not having to replace the whole ESC. I believe this fan's 40mm. Let's take a closer look at it. Now I'm really excited to get this thing in that XRT. It's a pretty heavy truck and has a ton of upgrades. I expect this thing will do just fine in there. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to do in that 1/5 scale buggy. That thing's very, very heavy and should really put this thing to the test. And we can see this has a 50mm cooling fan, which is gigantic and really nice for keeping this thing cool. However, it's probably going to limit your upgrade options because there aren't very many 50mm RC cooling fans. However, I'm sure there are adapters that will make a nice beefy 40mm server fan fit this. Let's dig just a little bit deeper and take this plastic cover off too. This whole harness is fairly easy to remove. It's got a little push tab behind it, and the sensor harness comes off the same way. And now we've just got 6 1.5mm screws. While I'm taking this off, if you like seeing these deep dive teardowns into the latest electronics, make sure you get subscribed. We've got a lot of really cool stuff coming up that you're definitely not going to want to miss. And pulling this cover off, we can see we have a nice tidy looking circuit board in here. This is completely potted in clear resin, so this is a nice waterproof system. We get a good look at those big beefy 8mm terminals and a giant heatsink. Underneath this heatsink are going to be all the power MOSFETs that translate your input power to your output power. Now, whereas the circuitry and everything's completely waterproof, these connectors technically aren't. Unlike Hobbywing, which chose to go proprietary for their sensor connectors on their ESC and motors in the G2 line, Castle has chosen to keep the standard connectors that they've always used. And whereas these types of connectors can be made water resistant through conformal coating of the board, etc., there's always going to be the opportunity for water and debris to get in behind these pins and cause corrosion and problems. Now that being said, I've gotten plenty of these wet plenty of times and I've never really had any issues with it, but it is something to keep in mind. Now while I'm putting this whole thing back together, let's take a closer look at how this works. In order to connect to these Castle Cobra ESCs, you're going to need one of the latest USB-C versions of the Castle Link hardware. Basically, this just converts the USB signal to what is probably a standard serial signal. And the reason you need an updated version is because the 32-bit ESCs run a different processor, which require a different type of conversion. You'll also need the latest version of the Castle Link V2 software that you can download from Castle's website. And once we get all that hooked up, we can see we've got a ton of options here. All of these options are really the beauty of these Castle Cobra ESCs. As you can see here, you can set the LiPo cutoff voltage. There are a bunch of preset voltages, and you can set your own custom voltage. This is really handy if you're running an unusual battery or if you're running a battery that's going to sag significantly below what would normally happen. Being able to set a custom voltage will allow you to have an LVC that still kicks in, but not when you don't want it to. Of course, if you don't want to set a custom voltage, you can choose from one of the voltages that they have here on a per cell basis. Same thing goes for the BEC. You have the ability to set a bunch of different voltages all the way up to 8.5 volts or whatever custom voltage you want. And you can also turn off the error and idle beeps as well as set the fan to be always on on if you don't want it to be thermostatically controlled. We also have a ton of different power options. The start power is the amount of power that's going to initially be given to the motor right when you hit the throttle. This is different from punch control and can help prevent a big battery sag right when you hit the throttle. That battery sag can cause problems with motor startup, so this is a really important setting to have access to. You can also set the maximum power output, reverse percentage, and then of course that punch control is available as well. Keep in mind that this punch control is the opposite from Hobbywing ESCs. 0% punch on a Hobbywing ESC is as soft an acceleration as you can get, while 0% punch control on a Castle ESC is the maximum acceleration you can get. These ESCs also have the ability to perform torque control. Basically, after allowing it to test your motor, this will limit the amount of power the motor is putting out as opposed to the amount of power that's going to the motor. It's a subtle difference, but something that's nice to have in certain situations. We've also got a bunch of braking options. Brake amount is pretty self-explanatory, but the brake lockout time is something you really need to be aware of. Basically, this is how long the throttle has to be at neutral before it'll allow a change of direction. If you have this set too high, it can seem like the ESC isn't responding, but it is a nice safety feature, again, in certain situations. And then below that, we have the reverse to forward brake amount. This allows you to set as a percentage of your braking capability how much brake's going to be applied when you go from reverse to forward. This is as opposed to some ESCs that just apply full forward throttle when you go from reverse to forward, which can be very jarring. And then below that, we have the drag brake and drag brake ramp. These are usually used for crawlers and give you braking when the throttle's in neutral rather than having to apply the brake yourself. Here we have the ability to set the function of the auxiliary wire. This is really cool because it allows you to take a channel on your transmitter and control a bunch of different functions rather than having to go into Castle Link and program them. You also have access to the throttle deadband adjustment. Throttle deadband makes sure that you don't have your car creeping forward or backward when your transmitter's in neutral. Depending on the type of transmitter you have, there might be some inaccuracy in where that throttle position is, and the deadband can help make up for that inaccuracy. Under the motor options, we have the ability to change motor direction, do motor current limiting, change the sensorless timing, and then adjust the motor temperature cutoff. Motor temperature cutoff is only available for censored motors and only if the motor itself actually supports it. Logging on these ESCs is really nice and really comprehensive. You have the ability to choose what you log, how often the logs are overwritten, and then there's a built-in log analyzer which lets you take a look at all the different parameters, and this can be really, really helpful if you're trying to troubleshoot something or if you're pushing these ESCs to their limits. Finally, you have the ability to set brake, throttle, and reverse curves. Most transmitters also allow you to do this, but if your transmitter doesn't, this is a great option that can soften up throttle and brake application to make driving the car easier. All right, guys, enough talking about it. It's time to get this thing in the car. The first thing we need to do is solder on some connectors. I'm going to use QS8s. You definitely want to use some big, beefy connectors for an ESC like this. XT90s probably aren't going to cut it. In the XRT, we're going to be replacing the Max 5 G2. This is a really good ESC, though it's definitely not without its flaws. One of them is less than perfect compatibility with sensorless motors. This motor is censored, but we're going to be running it sensorless with the Cobra 5. I'm really familiar with how this motor feels in this truck, so it should give us a great idea of how the ESC itself performs. One really nice thing about mounting this is that these screw holes are way deeper than the competition. That makes it a lot easier to find screws that'll actually fit. Castle has some of the beefiest BECs in the industry, and to get the full 20 amps of power to this system, you're going to need to connect both of the included cables to your receiver. These little connectors just can't handle a full 20 amps individually. Castle also gives you lots of extra cable, which can be a bit of a pain for cable management on a truck like this, but should be great for that 1/5 scale truck. All right, guys, she's all wired up. Let's go see how she handles some sensorless bashing. Oh, she's got some pep. That feels really good. Woo-hoo-hoo. Oh yeah, this is an awesome feeling ESC. Plenty of power. We'll check the logs when we get done, but for now, let's bash. Well, guys, that felt absolutely awesome. This thing wasn't even really breaking a sweat, though. I actually broke the stock fan halfway through bashing. I kept going, and it barely even got hot. And this is a heavy truck for an XRT. So now it's time to break out the big guns. We're gonna take this massive motor and use it along with the Cobra 5 to convert this massive 35-pound gas buggy. This thing's from 30 degrees north, and we don't actually have an electric conversion kit, so we're gonna have to do it ourselves. And while we're at it, we're gonna do some upgrades that are gonna make it even heavier. The first thing we need to do is get this 2-stroke engine out of here. And of course, my normal hex bits are too small. Big toys mean big tools. One thing I really like about this gas buggy is it comes with a muffler, unlike most gas RC cars, which makes it a lot quieter. I know having a loud engine's fun, but it does get old after a while, and it can really annoy your neighbors. Of course, that's all gotta come out. We definitely won't be needing this fuel tank anymore. And with that, we can get this big greasy mess out of the way and get our first look at where the motor's gonna go. Since I bought this buggy a couple of years ago, the version 2 has come out, and Fearless RC has an entire kit that includes a wing, shock towers, springs, revised shock bodies, longer arms, and a bunch of other parts. First, we're gonna start in the rear. This should come apart like any normal basher, just a lot bigger. The V2 kit from Fearless RC does come with wider arms, but I went even wider. It's been a while since I bought them, but I think I'm using the arms off their short course truck. As you can see here, the new arm's quite a bit wider than the stock one. I'm really excited to see how that's going to affect handling. But before we put that in, we need to swap out this shock tower. And now we just need to lengthen the links, and installation of all this stuff's gonna be the reverser removal. Let me get all this suspension installed and we'll move on to something more interesting. Okay guys, the wide kit is in. The final major thing we need to replace is this spur gear. We won't need these mechanical brakes, so we'll just swap it straight out for the new one. Hopefully this will just come right out of here. Yep. Next thing we need to do is install this big beefy 2028 800 kV motor. I've got an equally beefy mount for it, and that'll take the place of the gas engine. And now for the Mod 1.5 pinion gear, I chose a 20-tooth gear. I think that'll be just about right based on the kV of the motor, the voltage we're going to apply, and the speed the original engine worked at. And there we go. Let's get the ESC installed. Surprisingly, even with all this room, given that this is not an electric vehicle to begin with, there's not a lot of options for places to put the ESC. Fortunately, I think we're going to be able to squeeze it in right here without too much trouble. Of course, we're going to want to clean this surface really well before installation, given that this was covered in oil and grease previously. You can see just how much dirt we got up from there. That would definitely stop the double-side tape from working properly. Before we install it, we need to replace this stock fan, which broke in the last bashing session. Unfortunately, Castle still uses this fairly proprietary fan connector. Fortunately, the beefy rocket fan that I got to replace it has a really nice long cable, so I'm actually just going to run this straight over to the receiver box. We'll lose the thermostatically controlled fan, but I don't really care about that, and it's just easier than having to solder on a new connector. Obviously, you could remove the connector from this fan, solder it onto your new fan, and then you would still have that thermostatic control where the fan turns on and off based on the temperature of the ESC. As you can see here, one of the fan blades broke, and that's what killed this fan. We've got a stick in here. That might have been the cause. These rocket fans are pretty tough though, and I suspect it'll last a little bit longer. Of course, the fan's thicker too, so we're gonna need longer screws. The original screws are Phillips-headed self-tappers, but you can easily oversize the holes to M2, which fits just about right. And then finally, we can install the ESC using some good old VHB. All right, guys, she's just about ready to go. We got the ESC installed and wired up. I just need to support the back of this motor. Now, normally I would just 3D print something to go here, but I know not everyone has access to a 3D printer, which is why I always save this really high density foam. I'm gonna just cut a piece of this out and shove it under the back, which should work just fine. Now we'll just jam that under there. Now this high density foam comes in all sorts of different packages. If you aren't saving it, I definitely recommend you do because it's great for a lot of different purposes in the hobby. And there we go. That should give the motor some much needed rear support. And the final thing to figure out is where to put these batteries. I think I'm just gonna put them in the side pods here, do a little bit of trimming of the plastic, and then Velcro strap them down. And now for the finishing touch. All right, she's all set. Let's see what the ESC can really handle. Sounds mean. Full throttle. That's pretty quick. Another pass. Full throttle. All right, one more pass. Let's see what we got. 50 miles an hour. That's pretty good for this nearly 40-pound buggy. Let's see if it can bash. think about the Castle Cobra 5? Well, I really like it, but there's been a bit of a recent twist that might change people's mind in the long run. We'll talk about that in a minute, but first, let's talk about the two different versions and what you get in each one. This is the base Castle Cobra 5. This is designed for bashers in general use. It's gonna have internal protections that prevent you from doing something silly and melting it to the ground. It comes with 8 AWG wire and is gonna come in at $279. The other version is gonna be the Ghost RC Ace, and that's gonna be designed for speedrunners and anybody that needs to get absolute maximum power out of their ESC. It's gonna come with 6 AWG wire and some features that you're not gonna get in the regular base version, including perfect pass launch control. Perfect pass launch control basically allows you to independently control how fast the vehicle accelerates. So regardless of how fast you pull the trigger on the remote, the car is going to accelerate at a set rate. This is great for speedrunners because it allows them to get maximum traction through that acceleration without losing control. You're also going to have more aggressive timing options and fewer protections overall that'll allow you to get more power out of the Ace, but could potentially lead to you melting the thing down if you don't know what you're doing. The Cobra 5 is going to be $280 and the Ghost Ace version is going to be $350. Now both of those are a lot of money, but everybody that does speedrunning is currently using an XLX2, and there's a very good reason for that. These things put out the most power of any ESC you can get from a major brand. Of course, that might be changing because Hobbywing just released a new version of their Max 5 HV, and it has a higher current output rating than the previous version did. Whether or not that's going to be better than this, we're going to have to find out when it comes out. Overall, though, I really like this ESC. I think the initial punch from a Castle ESC is better than any Hobbywing ESC. The programming options you get are definitely superior. I really like the replaceable wiring harness, and the large standard size fan makes putting an upgraded fan on it a lot easier than on the G2 Hobbywing ESCs. Things I'm excited to see them improve in the future will be the switch. As you can see, I already broke this one, and it would be really nice for them to have a built-in solution for programming and data log retrieval. The latest Max 5 does have Bluetooth connectivity, which is really handy, and it would be nice to see them come up with a similar thing in the future on this. Overall, I expect this thing to be an absolute beast for people that want to bash. The Ghost version is going to be a monster for people who are speedrunning, and I think if you want the best high-power, large-scale ESC out there, this is probably going to be what you're going to want to buy. If you want the best RC content, you're going to want to get subscribed to this channel, and you're going to want to watch one of these videos.